some ways, what I have to say to you today is a little bit of an extension of my first Friday lecture about fighting theater with theater, and it has to do with the power of words. As Michael said, my title today is Words at War, Rhetoric as a Weapon of Mass Destruction. And I've kind of picked both the title and the subtitle because, you know, they sound like things to me. You know, Words at War, you know, is that History Channel series about the world at war for a long time. And of course, anything as a weapon of mass destruction now catches one's attention. And what I mean by this for today's talk is, I think can be boiled down to what I'm going to say today is a version of the old chestnut that guns don't kill people, people kill people. And that this can be applied at the level of, you know, individuals obviously, but can also be applied at the larger level of states and also at the level of war. And I don't mean any direct political implications from this, but I do mean to take it as a consideration when we're dealing with actual or putatively great statesmen, and I'm not casting any aspersions on any of our three grandees, but you know, what statesmanship involves, and certainly in these three cases, how often has to do with war and the killing of people. And therefore, looking at what goes into that seems to me to be significant and important. So this is going to be a version of guns don't kill people, people kill people. And I'd like to begin with a brief consideration about the nature of war. And to do that, I want to turn to one of the classic theoreticians of war in the Western tradition, Karl von Clausewitz, whose seminal treatise on war was published posthumously in 1832, and it stands to this day as one of the great texts on the philosophy of war. And many people are familiar with von Clausewitz's famous dictum, which can be phrased in several different ways, that a war is a continuation of politics or policy by other means, by which he meant that war, although it has its own means, so to speak, is a part of the social life of states. It is a part of the intercourse of states. It's a particularly bloody form of intercourse, but it's a form of intercourse nonetheless, and that actually in the actual conduct of war, many times literally in the heat of battles and ongoing battles, those engaged in the war often lose sight of the larger objective, that the war is being fought for some other reason. I mean, of course, in the actual war, the focus is victory, reasonably enough. But it's not victory for victory's sake from von Clausewitz's point of view. It's victory for some other purpose. And to always maintain a clarity of what that other purpose is while the war is being conducted. And then he goes on and details various aspects of how wars can be conducted and so on. And therefore, as a philosopher of war, I know that phrase can sound a little bit odd, but he's trying to think theoretically and analytically about this major human endeavor. He begins book one on the nature of war, reasonably enough, with the question, the very Socratic question, what is war? Okay, and his basic answer is that war is an active force to compel our enemy to do our will. It's an active force to compel our enemy to do our will. From this point of view, therefore, force is the means of war, and to impose our will on the enemy is its object. And the bulk of von Clausewitz's analysis follows from that. So if the goal is to impose our will on the enemy, how can we go about that in a war context? And he says that in a normal course of war, there can be three broad objectives to the war. One is, or focuses of the military effort. One is the armed forces, the ability to inflict violence. The other one is the country or the land of the enemy. And the third is the enemy's will. So he says the fighting forces must be destroyed. The enemy's fighting forces must be destroyed. Their country must be occupied. Yet both these things may be done, and the war, that is the animosity and the reciprocal effects of hostile elements, cannot be considered to have ended so long as the enemy's will has not been broken. In other words, so long as the enemy government and its allies have not been driven to ask for peace or the population made to submit. He goes on, we can see now that in war, many roads lead to success, and that they do not all involve the opponent's outright defeat. They range from the destruction of the enemy's forces, the conquest of his territory, to a temporary occupation or invasion, to projects with an immediate political purpose, and finally, to passively awaiting the enemy's attacks. Any one of these may be used to overcome the enemy's will. The choice depends on the circumstances. So, naturally enough, Clausewitz's focus is on the war and the enemy. And that force, therefore, as we said, is a means to changing the enemy's will. This is how we get the other guys to want to not fight anymore. Of course, there's another half of the problem. How do we get our guys to want to fight? Okay? Well, you can actually use the same Clausewitzian principle on our side, which is you can force our guys to fight. For those of you who are in the basic program or have read Herodotus' history, one of the famous anecdotes that appears in Herodotus' history in Book 6 is when the Persian king Xerxes is talking to the Greek Demaratus about what to expect when the Persians invade Greece, and whether or not the Greeks are going to put up a stiff resistance or not, especially considering that the Persians are going to outnumber them, 10 to 1, 100 to 1, 1,000 to 1. And Demaratus says consistently that the Greeks will fight valiantly and to the last man if need be. And Xerxes, the Persian king of kings, is clearly bewildered by this. And as Herodotus says it, Xerxes laughed and said to him, "Now I would like to see this in plain reason. How could 1,000 or 10,000 or even 50,000 confront so great an army as mine if they were all alike free and not subject to one command? We would be more than 1,000 to 1 if they were 5,000 strong. If they were commanded by one, as our men are, the fear of him, and reaching beyond the courage that is natural to them, they might go forward, though few against many, under the compulsion of the lash. But being suffered to be free, they would do neither of these things." So clearly, from an imperial point of view, from a tyrannical point of view, one of the ways we get our guys to fight is by putting guys behind them with whips, so that they have no compulsion but to fight. But if we're dealing with a democracy where we're not going to have whippers behind the army, there remains the problem of how do we get our guys to fight? And the solution seems to be words, rhetoric. The use of political language is what's used time and time again to motivate, and again, I'm not taking a stand whether this is right or wrong, in whatever context it may be, but the way in which our guys are motivated to fight in a democracy is through the use of words, not through the lash, or through the lash of the words, if you want to call it that, through rhetoric. And actually in Plato's dialogue, the Gorgias, which has an encounter with a sophist or a rhetorician by the name of Gorgias, Socrates asked Gorgias, what is this art that you practice, Mr. Gorgias? What is this thing called rhetoric? And Gorgias defines it in the dialogue as the power to convince by your words the judges in the court, the senators in the council, the people in the assembly, or in any other gathering of a citizen body. In other words, you can speak and persuade the multitude. And from Gorgias's point of view, this art, this ability to use words to persuade, is literally the greatest boon, for it brings freedom to mankind in general, and to each man dominion over others in his country. And it's this last part I want to just focus on for a minute, this idea of dominion over others in your country. That, in other words, this art of rhetoric, this art of public speaking, is used to persuade people, and when you can persuade people in a democratic setting, whether it's in the court or in an assembly or in a recruiting meeting or something like that, that you are exerting your will over them. You're transferring your will to them. And therefore, we can understand from starting from Clausewitz's perspective, that war can be this contest of wills between maintaining our guy's will to fight and crushing the enemy's will to fight. And so if we look at these speeches that we've been given as prior readings for today's symposium, I'd like to walk through some of these. I can't do all of them. And I'm actually going to kind of do them in reverse order, because I'd like to start with Churchill, and then go to Lincoln, and then go back to Pericles. And look at how these speeches are being used. I mean, they're being used for a lot of purposes, many of which are beyond the scope of what I'm trying to drive at here. But among the purposes that these speeches are being used for, I think is, and when you say it this way, it's so conventional, morale building. But what is morale building? Morale building is building up the will of our guys to fight, okay? Now, a lot of times this is not difficult to do. I mean, a lot of times, like especially before a war, rah, rah, everybody, let's go. Not a problem. Or after a great victory, of course, morale on our side is very high. But there's a problem, in the two other cases that often occur. One is when we've suffered a grievous defeat. Because at that point, naturally enough, there's a desire to whoa, maybe we should stop. Okay? And that's a problem if the leadership wants to continue prosecuting the war. Likewise, there can often be victories for our side that are so costly in themselves that it still raises doubts about the wisdom of continuing to prosecute the war. And in the case of Churchill and in the Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, we have both of these cases, because the speeches that we have from Churchill are from the early days, not the very beginning actually, but from the early days of the Second World War. And right after, most of these speeches were right after the British had suffered a grievous defeat at Dunkirk and the withdrawal of over 250,000 men through a flotilla of boats. And likewise, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address obviously is after the Battle of Gettysburg, which though it was a victory, and many say the turning point in the Civil War, was nonetheless the single battle with the highest casualties up until that point, of over 50,000 casualties from a single 3-day conflict, okay? And, in hindsight, knowing how the war turned out and being good Americans, or maybe even Northerners or Illinoisans or whatever it is we are, of course, it may be hard to transport oneself back in time, but actually, even in the North, there was not unanimous opinion about the prosecution of the Civil War. And certainly, after the number of people that were killed at Gettysburg, because still people didn't know that it was the turning point in the war then, okay? And actually, it turns out that even Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, for many people, was rubbing salt in the wound. That for even many good patriot unionists, even here in Chicago, denouncing the Gettysburg Address as treason, okay? So clearly the rhetoric axe can go both ways. So if we turn to the case of Churchill and the Second World War, I want to just set a little bit of historical context to remind you, or inform you if you don't know, just some of the events leading up to these speeches of Churchill that we've been doing for our reading. Prior to the actual opening of the Second World War on the 30th of September in 1938, there is was known as the Munich Agreement, which was this famous agreement between what would be the Allied powers and the Germans, allowing Germany to annex pieces of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. And this whole issue of whether or not, even echoes down to our day, because Neville Chamberlain, who was the British Prime Minister of the day, was accused of appeasement, that not standing up to the Nazi tyrants and by appeasing them, making things worse. Maybe this is true, maybe it's false, but this was in September of 1938. Germany did invade Poland on the 1st of September 1939, and on the 3rd of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. And surprisingly enough, or for me, as I was doing research about this, because I did the usual world history class in high school and so on, but trying to find out more about this particular period, the war in Europe between September 1939 and May 1940 is actually historically known as the Phony War. because there was not actually much combat taking place in Western Europe for the first 9 months of the war. Poland was occupied. There was battles in the Atlantic, U-boats and shipping and stuff like that. But on the main and the western part of Europe, things were relatively calm. And there were battles, but it wasn't all-out war. It wasn't until the 10th of May on 1940 that the Germans decided to invade France by way of the Low Countries and Belgium and Luxembourg. And on that day, Neville Chamberlain resigned as Prime Minister of Britain, and Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. That was the trigger event, was the invasion of France. And the first speech that we have in our collection comes from 3 days later, and I'll come back to that in a minute, the Blood, Toil, Tears, and Sweat speech, which is Churchill's taking the reins of government and making his announcement to the House of Commons about the government's plans. So this was on the 13th of May. Between the 26th of May and the 3rd of June, there was the evacuation from Dunkirk, in which 225,000 British soldiers and 120,000 French and Belgian soldiers were sea-lifted from the port of Dunkirk to Britain in order to prevent them from being either annihilated by the advancing German army or taken prisoners of war. And at the time, of Churchill's first speech, of course, he didn't know how this was going to work out. And by the time of the second speech, which was given on the 4th of June, 1940, this is the We Shall Fight on the Beaches speech, the evacuation of Dunkirk had been completed with tremendous success. On the 10th of June, 1940, however, Italy declared war on Britain and France. So now there's another enemy. And on the 18th of June, Churchill gave his finest hour speech. On the 25th of June, 1940, France surrendered to Germany. So therefore, what's called the Battle of France came to an end. And on the 10th of July, what's known now as the Battle of Britain began. And this was largely an air war, which was to suppress the British air defenses in preparation for a seaborne invasion of Britain. It would be like D-Day in reverse. Okay, which was going to be known as Operation Sea Lion. And on the 20th of August, Churchill gave the speech that we have called The Few. And by the 17th of September 1940, the British, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, had won the air battle of Britain, and the German plans for the invasion of Germany, for the invasion of Britain, were called off, were postponed. So when Churchill became the Prime Minister, as a leader of a country at war, he had a few obvious goals. One was not to lose the war, okay? And this is a military thing, not to lose the war, not to go the way of Poland and France, okay? It was a bad way to go. Secondly, because it's a transition of the government in the middle of a war, his goal is to build confidence in the new government, both within the parliament and within the country at large and in the larger world, that this government knows what it's going to do to win the war. And thirdly, and not to be lost sight of, Churchill's biggest strategic goal at the time was to bring the United States into the war on his side. Okay? And that therefore, the tools that Churchill had at his disposal to him at this time was basically one, his oratory. Okay, and this is actually all of the great speeches, I'll say all of them, but predominantly the great speeches for which Churchill is known came from this period in 1940 and not thereafter. In fact, there's an article from a couple of years ago, was the 70th anniversary of 1940, and an article in the New Yorker by a fellow by the name of Adam Gopnik, writing about Churchill's speeches and his finest hours. He writes that Goethe once wrote that Hamlet was a man who was asked to do something that seemed impossible for that man to do. Churchill is a kind of Hamlet in reverse, a man who was called on late in life to do the one thing he was uniquely able to do, and he did it. And for those of you who know anything about Churchill's biography, and some of you may have seen, we had a film session at the Gleacher Center, that Churchill in many ways was a misfit. I mean, from just about everything. And apparently along with his misfittedness from early on in life, was possessed of a tremendous sense of self-importance and grandiosity. And somehow the occasion found the man. And as Gopnik writes, when Churchill became prime minister, he said, with nothing else to be done, Churchill began to speak. He gave 6 major speeches in Parliament or on the radio in the next 4.5 months, and much of his reputation rests on those. His admirers, including Isaiah Berlin, who wrote a study of Churchill's diction soon after the war, point to his several stylistic sources: the suave ironies of Gibbon in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the portentous periods of Macaulay, Dr. Johnson's Latinate constructions. Gibbon, in particular, is present everywhere in the urge to balance every clause at the beginning of a sentence with a companion clause at the end, and in the paragraph play of slow build and snappy payoff. So that clearly that Churchill's classical education, his familiarity, hey, with the kinds of stuff we read in the basic program. Should you ever need to go to war, my friends? And that actually many of Churchill's contemporaries thought that Churchill's language in general was pompous, bombastic, archaic, out of place, grandiose, you name it. And, that I think, as this article is going on anyway, that everybody kind of agrees with that. But in this one occasion of the beginning of the Battle of Britain, it was exactly the right kind of language for the moment. The article continues, says, Churchill's rhetoric is dense with dying metaphors. The light of history will shine on all your helmets, was his farewell to his war cabinet. Sentimental archaisms and pretentious diction. Yet it works. Words make sense only in context, and sentences find meaning only in circumstances. Churchill ought to sound absurdly archaic. In the June 4th speech, for example, he quotes Tennyson, "Every morn brought forth a noble chance, and every chance brought forth a noble knight." This is from Tennyson's Mort d'Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table. Okay? Instead of summoning up a bygone rhetoric, he places the day's horrors in a nation's history. The monstrous tyranny and the lamentable catalogue add to Churchill's trumpet a ground base of memory, the history of the rhetoric of his own people. Churchill is a cavalier statesman who could never survive Roundhead strictures on ornament and theatrical excess in speaking. That's why he could supply what everyone needed in 1940, a style that would mark emphatic ends. There is no good news. Conventional ideas. We are an ancient nation. Old-fashioned emphasis. We will fight. Perhaps the style never suited the time. It suited the moment. The archaic poetic allusions in the June 4th speech, the reference to King Arthur's knights, the echoes of Shakespeare and John of Gaunt's Oration on England, are there to say, what's to fear? We've been here before. The images are stale. The metaphors are violent. The atmosphere is dramatic. And the moment justifies them all. This article goes on to note that Churchill's important public oratory ceased even before the Battle of Britain was over. It was the right thing for the moment, and actually I had been reminded of T.S. Eliot's poem, Little Gidding, that history is England and history is now. That this idea that whatever is happening, and this can only be, no, I say only done by the English, but it can only be done by a country with a certain kind of history, to use the rhetoric of the great moments of trial of the past to contextualize the current moment of trial, and that there will be something after and some kind of victory. And through this, obviously, we know that how history has worked out, that Churchill's rhetoric was able to motivate, first of all, his own people, and I'm not saying that his rhetoric was the only reason for this, but it was a component part of persuading the United States to come into the war on the side of Britain. Hopefully we'll have a chance to look at some of these speeches either during the question and answer period or this afternoon when we have the discussions. But I'd like to turn now to Abraham Lincoln, and most of my thunder has been stolen here with because I want to talk about the Gettysburg Address. I'm just kidding. I was going to read it, but since it's been done so well, I'm not going to do it. But I want to talk about the historical context in which the Gettysburg Address was presented, and also building on Professor Gary Wills's approach to understanding what Lincoln was doing in the Gettysburg Address. It encompasses many things, but one of them I'd like to focus on is, again, this notion of morale building and getting our guys, our side, to want to continue the fight against a formidable foe. So the historical context leading up to this one, briefly, is that in the 6th of November, 1860, Lincoln was elected President of the United States. On the 20th of December, South Carolina seceded from the Union. On the 9th of February, 1861, the Confederate States of America was formed. And on the 4th of March, 1861, Lincoln was sworn in as president. The inaugurations used to be in March rather than in January. On the 12th of April, 1861, Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, was fired upon, and the Civil War officially began. And over the remainder of 1861 and 1862 and into the first half of 1863, of course, the Civil War began. And as most of you, or all of you recall, no doubt, the early parts of the war were not good for the Union side, predominantly. On the 1st of January, 1863, Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation. I don't think that's one of the readings that we have as part of the collection for today. And it's a very important document for a number of reasons, but for the purposes here is that it was considered at the time a war measure. It was not, actually, the emancipation of all slaves in the United States. It was the emancipation of slaves in those parts of the country then in open rebellion. Okay, so there were actually places like in Louisiana, for example, where Union forces were in control, where the Emancipation Proclamation did not take effect. Okay, and actually it's kind of a conditional thing, because the idea is that if the states will come back out of rebellion, the Emancipation Proclamation won't go into effect. Okay, it's a bargain. And that's at the beginning of 1863. On the 3rd of March, 1863, the Union enacted a draft for the first time of men aged 20 to 45. On the 18th of May, 1863, the siege of Vicksburg in Mississippi began, and this was actually one of the other turning points in the war, was cutting off the west of the country, west of the Mississippi, by besieging Vicksburg. And the siege of Vicksburg was actually going on when the Battle of Gettysburg was going on. I mean, the siege was longer. On the 3rd of June, 1863, Robert E. Lee began the invasion of the North in this particular year's campaign. And between the 1st and the 3rd of July was the Battle of Gettysburg, which, as I mentioned before, up to that point was the battle with the single most number of casualties of any war, I believe, in the history of the world, with 50,000 casualties over 3 days. That battle ended on the 3rd of July with what's known as Pickett's Charge, which failed from the south. And on the 4th of July, and I think the date is significant, the 4th of July, the Confederate forces began their retreat from Gettysburg to go back to the south. And on the same day, Vicksburg surrendered. So those two things happened both on the 4th of July, the Northern War and the Southern War. And so it really was a kind of turning point. But nonetheless, sentiment in the North was not euphoric. On the 13th and 16th of July, there were draft riots in New York. People objecting to the recently enacted draft to have to go and fight in this crazy war. And as we've been told, the dedication of the Gettysburg Cemetery did not actually take place till the 19th of November, 1863. So the time when Lincoln and Edward Everett spoke, the whole dedication ceremony was many months after the battle itself had been concluded. And the issue is, the nominal purpose of the speaking that day is to dedicate the cemetery at the battlefield. As Representative Curry mentioned, the idea is that the main speaker of the day was not Lincoln. Okay, it was Edward Everett, and he spoke for a couple of hours. And as Gary Wills points out, that apparently in the 19th century, Audiences loved the long speakers. You know, they felt that they'd paid by the word or something. They were getting more value for their money. And Edwards delivered, and apparently it was a thoroughly lovely address. Everybody thought it was great. And somewhere near the end of the day's proceedings were a few remarks by that tall guy from Washington. Okay. Lincoln had really made it a special point to be there. That, I mean, not just to honor the dead. I mean, he was a politician. He was running the country. He knew there was trouble in terms of how the war was going to come out and whether the Union would be able to maintain, really, its will to continue the fight and to bring it to an end. And in an article Wills published in the Atlantic Monthly called "The Words That Remade America," Lincoln at Gettysburg, Gary Wills says this: "Lincoln was here to clear the infected atmosphere of American history itself, tainted with official sins and inherited guilt. He would cleanse the Constitution, not as William Lloyd Garrison had, by burning an instrument that countenanced slavery. He altered the document from within by appeal from its letter to the spirit, subtly changing the recalcitrant stuff of that legal compromise, bringing it to its own indictment. By implicitly doing this, he performed one of the most daring acts of open-air sleight of hand ever witnessed by the unsuspecting. Everyone in that vast throng of thousands was having his or her intellectual pocket picked. The crowd departed with a new thing in its ideological luggage. The crowd departed with a new thing in its ideological luggage. The new Constitution Lincoln had substituted for the one they had brought there with them. They walked off from those curving graves on the hillside under a changed sky into a different America. Lincoln had revolutionized the revolution, giving people a new past to live with that would change their future indefinitely. Some people, looking on from a distance, saw that a giant, if benign, swindle had been performed. The Chicago Times quoted the letter of the Constitution to Lincoln, noting its lack of reference to equality and its tolerance of slavery, and said that Lincoln was betraying the instrument he was on oath to defend, traducing the men who died for the letter of that fundamental law. And Wills then quotes from the editorial in the Chicago Times, which goes in part as follows: "It was to uphold this Constitution and the Union created by it that our officers and soldiers gave their lives at Gettysburg. How dared he then, standing on their graves, misstate the cause for which they died and libel the statesmen who founded the government? They were men possessing too much self-respect to declare that Negroes were their equals or were entitled to equal privileges." That's the Chicago Times for you. Wills concludes this part of his essay by saying, the Gettysburg Address had its deceptively simple-sounding phrases appeal to Americans in ways that Lincoln had perfected in his debates over the Constitution during the 1850s. During that time, Lincoln found the language, the imagery, the myths that are given their best and briefest embodiment at Gettysburg. In order to penetrate the mystery of his refounding, we must study all the elements of that stunning verbal coup. Without Lincoln's knowing it himself, all his prior literary, intellectual, and political labors had prepared him for the intellectual revolution contained in those 272 words. Now, I'm not have enough time now to go into a lot of detail about this, this idea of remaking the Constitution, but suffice it to say that up until Lincoln's time, the Declaration of Independence was a relatively minor document among the founding documents of the United States, and that it was the Constitution, in a kind of natural way, that had pride of place. And you can see in the other readings that we've had from Lincoln for today, the Lincoln-Douglas debate and so on, how over the course of the decade or so leading up to the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln is continually working with this idea of what the Declaration of Independence was and how to express that and how that had political consequences in Lincoln's understanding for the function of this country. And I would just say that if we look at the Gettysburg Address at itself, that it really, the opening is quite startling. He says, 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And if you just look at that, consider that imagery by itself, I mean, first of all, it's the imagery of birth, right? Now, you know, how the fathers are bringing this forth is a little bit dicey, although it's conceived in liberty, so I don't know, maybe it could work. But nonetheless, there's this idea that on July 4th, 1776, this little baby, this single thing called the nation, came to life, as opposed to this other thing about this social contract between these pre-existing states who decided that, well, it might be to our advantage to get together for a little while to, like, kill the other guy, okay? So Lincoln is, in a sense, with this address, rewriting American history in a way that suits his political agenda and not asking anybody's leave. He's just doing it. And the second part of this image is that somehow this new baby, this new nation that was born on this day, is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we could have a long discussion if you like, but I'm not going to go into it now, but you might think about what does that mean just as a matter of English? Dedicated to a proposition, any proposition. And then in this case, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It's perfectly true that the phrase all men are created equal appears in the Declaration of Independence. However, I would submit to you that within the Declaration of Independence, it does not appear as a dedication or as an aspiration. In fact, it's an axiom that allows the syllogism of the Declaration of Independence to proceed up to the point where the colonies are entitled to separate from Britain. Okay? But, you know, well, Declaration, yeah, sure, okay. All right, but the rest of the Gettysburg Address then goes on to deal with this battlefield that's just occurred. And in many ways, this is going to lead my segue into the next one, is in some ways a very, very condensed version of Pericles' funeral oration, okay? Because Pericles had the same problem that Lincoln had, the same problem that every, I presume, democratic leader in a military conflict has, which is, how do you deal with the dead, our dead? The other guy's dead is simpler. But how do you deal with our dead? Especially if there's been a lot of them. Because I presume, time and time again, the natural tendency is that a lot of people are either, you know, overcome with grief, don't want to continue the war, think somebody who's at fault for these people's deaths. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can come when we're about to honor soldiers, warriors who've died on our side of the battle. Lincoln says in this second paragraph in the Gettysburg Address that, you know, we're here to dedicate this battlefield for these dead. But in his final paragraph, and this is the one that I'd like to focus on, he says, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never remember what they did here. But now this is the punchline in a sense. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. Okay, talk about a guilt trip. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And I would just note, in terms of the general rhetorical analysis, beyond my larger point, my particular point, is that this idea about this new birth of freedom, right? And we can put it, if you want to put it into whole Christian imagery of death and resurrection. I mean, we're here, it was born, we're here at a cemetery, and apparently something has died, perhaps even in addition to the individual soldiers. But if we continue the fight long enough, there will be a rebirth, a reanimation, a re-coming to life of that thing which was first born 77 years ago. And Lincoln, I don't know, and I don't know whether anybody knows. I mean, it's a subject of speculation about to what degree Lincoln lifted this from Thucydides. Because in Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, as you've done, for those of you who have done your homework, one of Pericles' great speech is known as his funeral oration. And, as a matter of history, it's a little less clear, actually it's a lot less clear in this case, what really occurred. Because Thucydides says in the beginning of the Peloponnesian War that he, Thucydides, is making up the speeches that he's reporting in the book. And it's not clear in each case whether, to what degree what Thucydides is saying the speaker said is the gist of what the speaker said, or what Thucydides thinks the speaker ought to have said, or what would have been really great had somebody thought about it at the time. But nonetheless, at the end of the first year of the Peloponnesian War, the city of Athens is having its customary funeral for the dead, the warriors who have died in that year. And Thucydides introduces it like this. Thucydides says, in the same winter, the Athenians gave a funeral at the public cost to those who had first fallen in this war. It was a custom of their ancestors, and the manner of it is as follows. 3 days before the ceremony, the bones of the dead are laid out in a tent which has been erected, and their friends bring to their relatives such offerings as they please. In the funeral procession, cypress coffins are borne in carts, one for each tribe. Among these are carried one empty bier decked for the missing, that is, for those whose bodies could not be recovered. Any citizen or stranger who pleases joins the procession, and the female relatives are there to wail at the burial. The dead are laid in the public sepulchre in the most beautiful suburb of the city, in which those who fall in war are always buried, with the exception of those slain at Marathon, who for their singular and extraordinary valor were interred on the spot where they fell. After the bodies have been laid in the earth, a man chosen by the state of approved wisdom and eminent reputation pronounces over them an appropriate eulogy, after which all retire. Such is the manner of the burying, and throughout the whole of the war, whenever the occasion arose, the established custom was observed. Meanwhile, these were the first that had fallen, and Pericles, son of Xanthippus, was chosen to pronounce their eulogy. When the proper time arrived, he advanced from the sepulchre to an elevated platform in order to be heard by as many of the crowd as possible, and spoke as follows. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's a very long speech. But after having an opening, a proemium of the speech, Pericles does a very interesting thing, which is to not talk about the dead or the war at all. He talks about how great Athens is. It ends up being a eulogy of the country, of the city-state. And it turns out that when he brings this to a close, he says, after talking about all the great things of Athens, Pericles says, in short, I say that as a city, we are the school of Hellas, while I doubt if the world can produce a man who, where he has only himself to depend upon, is equal to so many emergencies and graced by so happy a versatility as the Athenian, and that this is no mere boast thrown out for the occasion, but plain matter of fact, is proved by the power of the state acquired by these habits. For Athens alone of her contemporaries is found when tested to be greater than her reputation, and alone gives no occasion to her assailants to blush at the antagonist by whom they have been worsted, or to her subjects to question her title to rule by merit. Rather, the admiration of the present and succeeding ages will be ours, since we have not left our power without witness, but have shown it by mighty proofs, and far from needing a Homer for our eulogist, or other of his craft whose verses might charm for the moment, only for the impression for which they gave to melt the touch of fact, we have forced every sea and land to be the highway of our daring, and everywhere, whether for evil or for good, have left imperishable monuments behind us. Such is the Athens for which these men, in the assertion of their resolve not to lose her, nobly fought and died, and well may every one of their survivors be ready to suffer in her cause. Okay? And he goes on a little bit further. You can see the recruiting poster coming. So I'd like to bring this to a close by just stating again that from my point of view, the thesis here is the old guns don't kill people, people kill people. And that the issue of war, from a Clausewitzian perspective, is this issue, it's ultimately a contest of wills. That we use force to bend the enemy's will to ours, and in a democracy, we have to use words to bolster our own will to continue the fight. And I'd like to close then with a pair of poems that were not on your reading list, but kind of convey this sentiment quite nicely. And they're from the First World War. And the first one is called In Flanders Field, which may be known to many of you, which was written in May of 1915 by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, who was a Canadian doctor in the Canadian forces in Flanders. And the poem goes as follows. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. Thank you.